好不？这么多年都是这个价格，我真的快疯掉了。
A meltdown during a live stream by China's so-called lipstick king.
这么多年都是这个价格，好吧，不要睁着眼睛乱说。有的是找自己的原因，好吧？这么多年了，工资涨没涨？有没有认真工作？
The online influencer was responding to a fan who complained that 79 yuan eyebrow pencils Li Jiaqi was promoting were too expensive, but the outburst would prove costly for Li, who earned his Lipstick King title for once selling 15,000 pieces of the cosmetics in 5 minutes. He scrambled to try and retain his crown with this tearful apology.
无论什么时候，我都不应该忘记我来自哪里，也不应该迷失自己。这两天我一直在反省，也看到了大家在网上的讨论。对不起，我让大家失望了。
But it did not work. Overnight, 1 million of Li's 30 million followers dropped him. China's state-run broadcaster CCTV weighed in, publishing an op-ed saying live streamers who battled with consumers were destroying their own rice bowls. But does this one influencer's public relations crisis tell us something about wider changes in China's economy? And what do those changes mean for the rest of the world? Consumer sentiment in China has remained pessimistic despite the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the first quarter of 2024, a survey by the country's central bank found more than 60% of urban residents planned to save more money. Only 10% said they thought it was easy to find a job. Market analysts have also noticed the country's middle class and young professionals are changing their spending habits.
The customer decision journey has become a lot longer. So when it comes to durability, price comparison, performance of the products they want to buy, I think such behavior changes happen not only because of sentiment, not only because they think saving money is cool, but because they really don't have much money or have a lot less money than before. So we are seeing salary and bonus cut in high growth sectors such as finance and tech.
That is not to say there are no winners amid the current market trends. Some domestic consumer brands are benefiting from the shifts. A 2023 survey showed 70% of online shoppers in China go local when buying clothing, while over 90% buy snacks and beverages from homegrown businesses.
They are more culturally relevant to the consumers, and there's encouragement from the central government for people to buy more made in China, design in China products. So that is one. And also traditionally, Chinese consumers see local brands having less premium.
But what is it like to be in the middle of all these changes? Yvonne works for one of China's tech giants. She joined back in 2017 when companies like her employer were known for hosting extravagant sales events and offering generous compensation packages. Yvonne asked us not to use her full name because she is not authorized to discuss internal company matters.
我感觉到这个组织有一点疯狂，就是有点像传销的感觉，就所有的人都想要创建团队，因为创建团队是最快的可以达到晋升的一个方法。就是因为整个的 package 里面可能有一部分是股价，然后 HR 在讲这部分的时候还会说现在是我们的低点，然后等到后面大概1年以后，你确实是肉眼可见的看到这个股价涨到了一个就是挺疯狂的高点。很多人其实是在把过去1年2年或者是几年的那个股票立刻变卖，他可以立刻拿这个钱去摇新房，然后可以立刻全款买下那个房。
But like at all parties, the music eventually stopped.
As China's crackdown on tech continues, business
to be a more muted event this year against a backdrop of regulatory crackdowns in China
and some of the China stocks are just getting whacked.
Chinese authorities initiated a regulatory storm targeting the country's big tech firms in late 2020, citing concerns that the major internet platforms were becoming too large and powerful. Authorities halted IPOs, launched antitrust investigations and fined tech companies for data security and anti-competition violations. The companies, which once rivaled their foreign counterparts in market capitalization, saw their share prices plummet, but the downward spiral has been reflected in more than share prices and news headlines. Yvonne says she started to feel the pinch in her career.
现在的那个表演更多的有点像是假装工作，你知道我没有在好好工作，我知道你知道我没有在好好工作，但是这个表演是要煞有介事的表演下去的。或者你没有非常严重的经济上的压迫感，所以你的这种冲动消费的频次比较高，你都会有一个概念叫做我值得更好的，我值得这个单品，会反复问自己我是否真的需要，我是为了满足我自己的预期，还是为了迎合他人的期待。
China's consumer price index has remained at a low level for nearly 1 year due to weak demand. Its March consumer price index went up by just 0.1%. Factory gate prices have kept dropping for 18 months, adding the pressure of an oversupply of goods. To survive, many Chinese companies are eyeing overseas to sell their products, but are facing growing pushback in the United States and the European Union, who accused China of exporting overcapacity, especially in the new energy sector.
And when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products, the viability of American and other foreign firms is put into question. I've made clear that President Biden and I will not accept that reality again.
If China wants to use manufacturing as the way out of its slowdown, that means for it to be successful, the rest of the world has to agree to increase consumption and reduce manufacturing.
Pattis, an economist based in Beijing, has long argued that China's economic model suffers from an over-reliance on investment-driven growth rather than domestic consumption. In 2022, consumption contributed to more than 50% of China's GDP. While that may seem like a lot, it lags behind domestic consumption in many major economies such as the US, Japan, and India.
But given how tense the geopolitical environment is, it's very clear that that's not going to happen. The US is already expanding its manufacturing share, so is Japan. India has made it very clear that they will not accept a reduction in their manufacturing share.
So what are the possible outcomes of this economic debacle? Pattis says there are 3 potential scenarios.
So rebalancing means that for the next few years or next few decades, consumption has to grow faster than GDP and investment has to grow slower than GDP. So one way that could happen is the good way, which has never happened in history. That is that China implements policies that drive up the growth in consumption to something like 7%. And this would allow them to bring the growth in investment down to 1 or 2% and still have GDP growth of over 4%. Could they do this? Yes, if they transferred about 1 to 2% of GDP every year from local governments to the household sector. That is, that consumption growth drops a little bit, but investment growth drops a lot and GDP growth drops a lot. So in that scenario, consumption growth in China could continue at 4% a year. Investment growth would drop to maybe 0 or even negative, but GDP growth would drop to around 2% or less a year. That's sort of the Japanese style adjustment. The third form of adjustment is sort of the way the US adjusted in the 1930s. The US in the first 3 years of the decade saw GDP contract by 35%. The US lost more than 1/3 of its GDP. Household income contracted by half of that. Very painful, but notice that household income grew relative to GDP. The advantage of that adjustment is that it's very quick. The disadvantage, of course, is that it's politically very destabilizing and very painful.
But how could China transfer income from the government to households? Patty suggests local governments could fund better social security programs that would increase the income of households. But it will not be an easy fit because many local governments are heavily in debt.
From a cash flow point of view, yes, they're in serious trouble because they relied so heavily on the real estate sector as an alternative for taxes. But don't forget, local governments own a lot of assets. The poster child of bankrupt local governments is Guizhou. And Guizhou owns many things, including they own Maotai, one of the most valuable companies in China. And so the question is, do local governments need to own all of these assets? No, in most countries, governments don't own so many assets. Can those assets be transferred directly or indirectly to the household sector to boost household income? In principle, yes. Politically, very difficult to do.
But trade war and geopolitical tensions aside, for ordinary people like Yvonne, finding clarity and certainty in such trying times is the key to staying sane.
我身边有蛮多的朋友都有焦虑抑郁，就是我自己去做了播客，然后它算是简单的小有成绩的做起来了，然后在这个筹备的过程当中，你也依然是通过很稳定的每一周去 update， 然后它一点点帮你去建立正向反馈。我觉得中国人真的就是，我跟你说，我觉得中国人的底色就是勤劳勇敢，就是他们就是遇到问题去找解决方法。
The problem is that what's best for ordinary people is not best for the economy. What's best for ordinary people is to be cautious and to increase their savings. But if everyone increases their savings, that reduces demand, so the whole economy slows down, and in the end, nobody has any more savings. So it's very tough. This is why policy is so important. Depending on what policies Beijing implements, we could see very, very different outcomes.
As China's young professionals cut back on spending and foreign leaders express concern about China's supposed excess production capacity, the way China manages its economic slowdown will significantly impact its domestic economic stability, its international relations, and life choices made by its people.